Hello, and welcome to the Road to Autonomy Podcast. I am your host, Grayson Brulte. The Road to Autonomy Podcast is brought to you in part by Florida Internet and Television. It's time to cut the tax on tech. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to have Jody Kelman, Director of Product Management, Self-Driving Car Platform Lyft. Welcome to the podcast, Jody.
Thanks for having me here, Grayson. Fun distraction in these quarantine and in California fire times.
Yeah, and we're going to have a really interesting conversation today. And for the listeners who don't know, you and I have known each other for quite a long time, so get ready for some good laughs.
We will attempt no inside jokes throughout the podcast, and I will only tease Grayson for his pink shirts, once or twice over the course of the hour.
All right, you got a deal. Jody, you graduated from Harvard with a BA in social studies and then moved to Sydney, Australia. What was the experience like going from Boston to Sydney, and what did you learn in the year you spent in Australia?
One, I love this question because it makes me feel like I'm a young 25-year-old again, shifting my self across the world. So I am someone who was sort of born with the travel bug. So in college, I think I found some way to go intern for the Irish government for a summer so that I could go live in Dublin. And then my very first job out of college, I actually worked for a Ugandan NGO in rural Uganda, where I knew I had done something officially crazy when I showed up in the capital, Kampala, and people said, "You're going where?" So I lived in the serious bush of Uganda for a bit, but I had gone to Sydney, Australia when I was 19 with my 85-year-old grandfather. And it was the last continent he wanted to see in the world before he died. And I had no desire to go. I grew up in Boston. I am a total sort of indoor person. The idea of like surfing on Bondi Beach was just like not my idea of a good time. But I loved my grandfather and I wanted to engage in this experience with him. So I went to Sydney and just immediately fell in love and said, somehow I have to get back here at some point in my life. And so I started reading the Australian newspapers every day from my perch in Boston and started reading a little bit about, it was sort of the early 2000s. And at the time, Australia had what was termed a refugee crisis. So there were refugees arriving by boat at the Australian shores every day, and it became kind of the seminal issue of their 2001 election. And so I decided to do my senior college thesis on Australian refugee policy, then went back for a year to do a Fulbright on Australian refugee policy and ended up staying for 2 to work in the McKinsey office there, a little bit of a shift in scope. But, for me, the big insight was as humans, we are fundamentally mobile creatures. So, I now live in San Francisco, California. I have friends who are foisted in every corner of the globe. And I think particularly the older I get and the more in the self-driving world, we're actually strangely hyper-localized. We'll talk more about that later, but self-driving cars tend to roll out in kind of these very small and specifically local pockets. And I think one of the big things I learned in that period was how much we are truly globalized as a world. And so I think it will be interesting over time as I combine those two aspects of my career and my life, where this one part that's hyper-global and then strangely, the self-driving portion is much more at this point in self-driving development, kind of hyper-local.
You mentioned that you were an intern for the Irish government. How did you craft that? Did you pick up the phone and call somebody, or?
I am the classic. I will walk into anyone's office and try and negotiate my way into the room. So there was a guy who was a fellow at Harvard for a semester my junior year, who was a previous, political advisor he was sort of the David Axelrod of the Irish government at that point. And I just said, hey, what would it take for me to come over? And I give a lot of advice to younger people starting their careers now. And one of the biggest pieces of advice I give, particularly to women, is always ask the question. You never know what is going to happen. And so I asked, he said, sure. And I told someone else about it. I was just talking about what I was doing for my summer, and they magically turned out they had a grant program that was giving people money who wanted to go spend a summer somewhere else in the world. So I got a great internship and got funded just through a process of talking and asking. And in some ways, that's strangely how I think that's very much in my experience of you, how you operate, right? You cold call the world and have built this incredible network of people who really are thoughtful in the same way about self-driving technology, literally by the fact that you were willing to pick up the phone and call anyone.
And that's a good point, because that's how we met. When I cold called you, and I was the co-chair of the Autonomous Vehicle Task Force for the city of Beverly Hills, I cold called you and said, "Hi, would you want to come put self-driving cars in Beverly Hills?" And you're like, "This guy's crazy." But then you came down and we had a great conversation, and things evolved. And then we became friends.
It's a really interesting, I think, general life philosophy, which is how do you stay open to opportunity as you start, we all become a little more jaded as we get older, and we have more precious we're much more precious with our time. But one of the philosophies that I try to follow is anytime I see someone who I think is fundamentally trying to do good in the world, I will take that first meeting to see if there's something we can do together to make it better. And so I'm deeply appreciative that we found each other that way.
No, it's totally awesome. And let's see, hopefully we can get a deployment somewhere where I live now. But that's a conversation for offline.
For listeners out there, Grayson and I have been trying to figure out a way to work officially together rather than unofficially together for maybe the last 4 years. So
we'll get there. Before you know it, we're going to have self-driving Lyft cars going around Palm Beach Island, and I'll be happy, and we'll finally do something.
I can't wait. That's my only bummer is that my grandmother did not live long enough to come take one of them down in Florida.
Well, but there'll be other elderly individuals that will
exactly.
be able to take it.
There will be many a Jewish grandmother who benefits from the technology, even if it is not mine.
So you learned a lot about technology, but you also know a lot about policy. So you interned in the Irish government, and then in 2008, you served on the Obama-Biden presidential transition team as a member of the Technology, Innovation, and Government Reform team. In that role, what did you do to assist and advise the incoming administration on innovation and technology?
It's interesting because I think this role was actually instrumental in sort of the work I do now at Lyft around self-driving car technology, because, I think people tend to underestimate the intersection between technology and policy in driving outcomes. So my role was really in thinking about how we could use technology to drive better performance management in government. So some people may think of this as an oxymoron, but basically, I believe that government exists to do things for people. And, whatever your political beliefs are about how much government one should have, I think we can all agree that if we're going to have any version of government, it should work as well as it can. And so what I was working on was developing a set of recommendations to the Obama administration around how they could use, for instance, data visualization and the public sharing of data to drive better performance outcomes. So how do we make water cleaner? How do we make kids more healthy? And how do we track that as a population? We've seen that work sort of translate into sites like data.gov and performance.gov, which the Obama administration launched, I think, in the first 2 years of their administration. So that really helped. To me, it's all about, it's almost the same fundamentals that you have as a product manager, which is it's all about how do you set a very clear target and then measure your progress towards the target and understand where things are going wrong. And so I think, particularly as we think about rolling out self-driving cars in the world, one of the things that really informs me is a lot of the NHTSA data on traffic fatalities. They are the source of how do we know how dangerous our roads are? And when we think about how we can make improvements by bringing self-driving cars to the road, what we should start to see as you roll out self-driving cars is that 94% of traffic accidents that are preventable coming down. And that's when my two worlds collide, and I'm able to see the work that I'm doing at Lyft really translate into these policy outcomes that make all Americans better off.
Did you happen to brief the transition team on self-driving cars?
I wish. It was still the era where DARPA, self-driving cars were the sort of stuff of DARPA challenges. We weren't yet in the sort of fully commercialized era. But, maybe if I'm lucky, and Grayson, I think our politics may differ a bit, but if perhaps in a new Democratic administration, I can come in and brief the new transition team on self-driving.
Well, our politics might differ, but we want what's best for humanity and what's best for our community, so we overlap there.
And by the way, I mean, not to get too off track, but the world would be a much better place if more people had the conversations that we have. So
it's healthy dialogue. And on the previous podcast, I had Johnny Morris, who's the head of policy for Embark, and he was a member of the Obama-Biden presidential team, and he gave advice to potentially President Biden on what he should do with self-driving cars. So you can tune in and listen to that one. It was really interesting.
Oh, so he was the person doing the briefing. I was just out of that loop. I was still a sort of performance wonk at that point.
If we have a change in administrations and you are to brief the presidential transition team on self-driving cars, what advice would you have for them?
Great question. I mean, I think one of the things we really think about a lot at Lyft is the intersection between regulation and the ability to roll out sort of new technologies in the world. So I think the first piece of advice I would have is work collaboratively with industry partners. Most of us want to work with you and want to create a framework. We are doing something very much new that is new for everyone in the world. And so the more we can collaborate on that framework, I think the better outcome we will see societally. But then, the other piece is federal legislation really matters here. I think people may, and a regulatory structure. So people may forget that if you have a patchwork of regulations that sits at the state level or even the local level, a self-driving car may have to be programmed to make a different decision as it rolls across, for instance, a county line or a state line. And so, the more we can harmonize the regulatory environment, the more we will be able to sort of focus on bringing out this technology, which to as many people as we can safely in the shortest period of time, which is, I know, something you're very focused on.
And when do you think that we'll see an AV Start Act where if you were to start in a Lyft in Southern California and go to Nevada, one thing we're going to get is where we can go over state lines. So as you grow to scale your business, you don't have a regulatory hurdle from each state. You can just scale across the entire United States. When do you think we get there?
So I guess first off, just orienting your listeners for people who have not ridden in a self-driving Lyft. The way that we think about this as Lyft is that self-driving cars should be part of your standard ride-sharing experience, right? You want to open up that same app that you are using to get to, for instance, when one can leave the house, your kid's soccer game, to take a self-driving car to that same event. And we want it to be very much a normal experience for you and part of your everyday transportation solutions. So if you were to go to Las Vegas or to Phoenix today, we already have self-driving cars live on the Lyft network. And this functions very much the same way that any ride-sharing ride does, right? You pull out your Lyft app and you request a self-driving Lyft instead of a classic Lyft. So with that said, I think certainly our first focus is on bringing the self-driving model to more markets, so more ride-sharing markets. I think we're less focused on, for us, the long-haul use case, just because that's much less of our business today. We really want to help people get from point A to point B within a given city, typically. And so I think that's where you'll see us focus first. I know 60 Minutes did a really interesting piece this weekend on long-haul trucking. And certainly we're starting to see some real signs of progress there that I think will pave the way for us to do long-haul passenger transportation as well. But I think for us, the focus is really on, how do we get you that safest, most comfortable self-driving Lyft within. For you, I need to bring it down to Palm Beach. For my parents, I need to bring it to Boston as soon as possible.
You mentioned long-haul passenger transportation. What is your vision and Lyft's vision for that? Or is it going from the LA to Vegas run? Is it going from LA to Phoenix, say San Francisco to Tahoe? Is it those kind of routes?
So Lyft started originally as a company called Zimride. back in 2013, which was a long haul transportation solution. So it was actually literal ride sharing from one campus to another. So our founder, Logan Green, was hanging out at UCSB, which was his college, and he wanted to get home to LA. So they started Zimride to actually allow people to sign up and share rides. And Lyft was a hackathon project that turned it into short haul transportation. So I don't know where we will go next with this. What I do know is that for us, our mission is always focused on improving people's lives with the world's best transportation. So I think you will see us focusing on those long haul use cases that we think have the biggest delta in people's lives. So it might look like better transportation access in particular. So something like someone who's commuting from an outer borough into an inner city and has to deal with multiple bus transfers at this point. Or it might look like something where, you're trying to help a family get to their family vacation with less infighting on directions. But it will be really interesting to see how this evolves. And you're seeing us start to play into some version of this with our Lyft rentals product, where we're actually starting to rent cars to people in individual markets so that, you can open up your Lyft app and it's good, not just for riding within a city, but if you want to rent a car for, a weekend trip for us, I guess it would be up to Napa, but for you out to the Everglades, this is going to be embarrassing in terms of my Florida geography.
No, it's great. So Napa, you can go drink great wine and we go out to the Everglades and hopefully not get eaten by an alligator.
By an alligator. That's exactly. Or find the ghost of Ernest Hemingway in Key West. That's so many options.
Because it would be really great at some point if there was a self-driving Lyft that would take you from Palm Beach down to the Keys, or even going over a 7-mile bridge from Miami to the Keys.
Well, when you start looking at the sort of end game of this technology, it gets super interesting where, you can outfit the cabin you can imagine a world where you've taken out all the seats and there's a bed that sits in the back of the car. But I think for now, for us, it's really about saying, how do we get that same sort of affordable, comfortable, safe transportation that you've come to expect from Lyft and just bring it to that next level? So, that car is always going to be the safest technology on the road. It's always going to be super clean and hygienic because it's been cleaned by us. It's probably going to be equipped with Wi-Fi or other cabin comforts that allow you, when you're commuting to work, to have this ultimate kind of private cabin that really allows you to extend. I'm laughing because I'm realizing I'm talking about a world where we go to work. I keep having to imagine a future that is both post-COVID and our self-driving future. But, we really imagine this as giving you back time in your day. I think we're all feeling what it means right now to get an extra hour or two of our days. There are many negatives of this period, but if there's one positive, I think it's that's an hour we can spend with our families, or an hour we can spend, learning something new. And I think when we think about self-driving technology, it's really this opportunity to give you that time back.
When the world begins to thaw and there's a vaccine and we kind of go back to whatever the new normal might be, you're starting to see some really pent-up demand from Visa and MasterCard around experiences. And you're seeing it with Airbnb when they're IPO filing. Are we going to see Lyft kind of shift to where the world's going if we go into this post-COVID experiences world where experiences just start booming, and then you kind of build this next level AV and with all this experience, and if you're going to go to Napa, it's got a little wine cellar in it on Ball Bearing so it doesn't ruin the wine, and if I want to go to the Keys, maybe it has my fishing rods in it. Is that kind of the future where you're going?
So, I think certainly post-COVID, what we're most excited about is just getting people back into their daily lives, making sure they can go, hang out with their friend across the city and get out of the four walls of their house. But when we do think about that self-driving future, you have these enormous opportunities for things like e-commerce within a self-driving car. I once took someone who was running her own Amazon business in one of our Lyft rides powered by Aptiv in Vegas. And we were talking about how she could trick this out into, a little mini storefront that travels to you, and she can kind of jump on the screen as the direct salesperson who's explaining what in her case, she was running a version of a nail salon, but she could explain how her product would affect your life. And so there just really is this possibility when you both reimagine the form factor of the car, but then also reimagine a car that can come to you and go wherever you need it to go without any human in the loop. We start seeing these remarkable possibilities for whether it's e-commerce. I think the one that excites me the most is really around virtual learning. So the idea of partnering, with something like a Khan Academy or a Coursera, where you've got what I imagine in my mind is the woman who does live in those outer burbs of the San Francisco Bay Area. It takes her an hour and a half in traffic to get to her job downtown. And at the same time that she's traveling in her self-driving Lyft, she can also be upskilling for the next role that will allow her to move a little bit closer in and not be part of the sort of traffic, the congestion issue that we are sort of facing in all major metropolitan areas. So there's this virtuous cycle where if you can give time back in these vehicles, you really open up possibilities to fully reshape the way we are living in our cities today.
You hit on a sensitive subject for me with learning. I'm a big staunch proponent of education, but I believe that education has to go around experiences. And I was doing this interesting research when I used to live in Beverly Hills about what grades learn different things. And I think it was like fourth grade, they start to learn about the desert ecosystem of the desert. And I was starting to talk to some teachers and individuals involved with LAUSD and education. And some of those kids have actually never been to a desert. They've never been to Joshua Tree. They've never seen a cacti. And I had this whole vision. I started, well, have they been to the Natural History Museum? Well, no, there's not a way for them to get there. And so I had this whole philosophy is that when we achieve full autonomy, that this mom can get into a self-driving Lyft and take that child to the desert because they do not have the transportation issues to get there. And that child can experience the desert. And I truly believe that you don't know what that's going to unlock in that child's mind. That child can go on to become a scientist or go on to become an astronaut because there's something in that experience that they've never seen before. And the other thing I also learned is that a lot of these children in inner parts of going into the Inland Empire outside of LA have never been to the ocean. And so then we could unlock a marine biologist. And so I think that if you look at self-driving cars, yes, we want to have all the fun experiences. We want to do the luxury wine tastings. But I think for those that are less fortunate, and especially those with children that don't have either the financial means or the transportation means to take them to experience a museum or to go to a better library, think about the possibilities that unlocks. And then when those children get older and they have those experiences, remember the time we went and saw the whale at the aquarium or we went to the desert, what that kid's going to go on to change the world? To me, that's the real true impact of self-driving, is the positive impact it's going to have on children in their future.
Grayson, I love that. And I love the idea that you're getting in your self-driving Lyft and you're taking a lesson on marine biology on your sort of in-car screen. And then you get to the ocean and as you come back, maybe your teacher has programmed a lesson, post-ocean quiz into your time back. So you're both learning before, during, and after, which is this sort of remarkable possibility as you're starting to integrate technology and transportation together. I love that you're starting kind of beginning of life. I also think on the other side of life, I will talk a lot about my memory of taking away my grandmother's car keys and what that meant for her life and her freedom and her sense of self. And so I feel like I have this sort of ticking clock where I need to get self-driving cars out on the road in time for my mom to have them when she's not able to drive anymore, because she is a remarkable woman who has been my role model of what spontaneity and curiosity and impact on the world has been for a lifetime. And the idea that she wouldn't get to experience the world anymore because she can't drive safely is really one of the things that sort of gets me up and keeps me doing this day in and day out.
That's powerful. You don't have to have that very hard talk, but then if you think about it from the emotional standpoint of that older individual, they have their freedom back.
Exactly.
My grandmother's 92 and she has to get driven everywhere. And so she just wants to go to the beauty parlor and she's like, I want to go have a gin and tonic, but they want to have their freedom to go when they want to go. They don't want to have to schedule it a week in advance to get to dial a ride or to have a relative take them. I just think that if we can give the seniors their mobility back, think of what it does to their quality of life, and they'll live longer because they're happy.
We did an amazing demonstration with the National Federation of the Blind in Las Vegas. So Aptiv, Lyft, and the National Federation of the Blind partnered to just allow a set of blind and visually impaired users to come try Aptiv's technology on the Lyft network. And it was so awesome to sort of watch. There was a range of ages. So literally everyone from like an 8-year-old kid to an 80-year-old woman, and just seeing them talk about what possibilities this could open up in their lives. I think, we forget what it is like not to have transportation access and easy access to mobility. And the moments where you see how people imagine this completely changing their lives, I think are some of the most powerful I get to experience. And certainly, especially in these very, very difficult times, give me hope that it is possible to sort of see our world improve and for the world to get better.
During those 100,000 rides that you've given with your partner Aptiv in Vegas, has there been any of these life-changing moments that have been documented that they talk about internally at Lyft where, a senior citizen or somebody just had this great experience and then it just opened up this world of possibilities for them?
So what we see coming out I get one of the sort of privileges of my job is I get to read a lot of the customer feedback directly. So anything that people enter in the app after their ride, I get to sort of read and digest. And I think you see less on the sort of completely transformational experiences. And I will say there's some overlap with the fact that Lyft and Aptiv are running in Vegas. We tend to have a certain consumer who's chosen to come to Vegas to begin with. But what you see are a huge number of people who are kind of awed by what this technology is going to be able to do. So I think, we had one guy who was on his 12th ride because just every time he did it, he loved experiencing what the car was doing so much that he kept coming back. We had one guy who wrote that, there were two things on his bucket list. One was propose to his wife, and one was try a self-driving car. And now he had done both. So, we see the joy that this brings to people's lives. And I think conversely, and this I think is less intuitive for people who don't spend their days sort of poring over this direct consumer feedback, we don't see any of the fear that people sort of that I think is a much more common narrative within the press. People who choose to try this are early adopters. They tend to be people who are excited about technology revolutions in general. But we see them saying over and over again that this is kind of normal and boring. And so what we at Lyft imagine will happen is that these early adopters start telling their friends who maybe are not quite as adventurous as they are, but are pretty game to try new things. And so their friends then try the technology because they've seen their friend do it and it feels a little more normal. And then once they've done it, they tell their mom. And so we slowly see this sort of coming up the adoption curve as you really get people into these cars and allowing them to see what the cars can do on the road today. So I think otherwise this feels like something that's like 30 years away, and it doesn't feel normal, and it feels like sort of a futuristic Jetsons-like technology. And what we really see is how people are responding to this today and the fact that they're ready.
You hit the nail on the head when they are ready, because there's a lot of individuals in the media that run with this fear-mongering nonsense. But when we look at your data, where you have a 96% approval rating of patrons that have written that, it's completely the opposite. You're getting real-world data. They're sitting behind a computer, making up some nonsense to sell clickbait. So when you're dealing with Lyft in the real world with your partner Aptiv and your partner Waymo in Arizona, and you're dealing with individuals over here for whatever reason have an agenda mostly driven by the trial bar, how do we come together to build the public acceptance of self-driving, since this technology is going to have an impact on every single individual's life, not just one subset of the population, but every single individual will benefit from this technology?
I do think a lot of it is normalizing it in everyday behavior. So it becomes, when we launched ride sharing almost a decade ago now, the idea that you would have gotten into a car with a stranger because an app told you it was okay would have seemed completely insane. And now this is, the most normal thing that you can do when, again, one leaves their house. It's actually much less normal to not get to use ride sharing. But I think, the same adoption curve we saw in ride sharing, which is you've got a set of early enthusiasts, they then transfer it over to their next set of friends who transfer it to their next set of friends. The biggest thing we can do is see this in people's lives so that it stops being an abstraction that's sort of a robot car and instead just becomes a way that you're getting around. And one of the big things we see in our data, in addition to the fact that 96% of people tell us they want to ride again, is that one of the most powerful proof points for people in taking their first self-driving ride is that another real person has taken a self-driving ride. And so as Lyft, we think that's one of the real roles we play in this transition to a self-driving future, which is we are the path to the consumer, and we are the same app that you've kind of known and trusted for over half a decade now. And so for us, it's about how do we get those consumers to show off to their friends that this is something that is real, and this is something that is here, and this is something that's going to have an incredible positive impact on my life. I think that's how you bridge the divide, is really making it's something that is tangible for people.
Do you feel that the trust of the Lyft brand combined with the comfort of the app or help driving some of that adoption, where they're used to the app, they trust your brand, they've had good experiences with your brand?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is very much, I will say, just for me, the reason I've been at Lyft for about 5 years, and I always say I spent my entire career looking for a job where the means and the ends combined, where I sort of very much believed in the mission of the company, but also we worked hard and smart, and the sort of quality of work was there. And Lyft is very much, this many years later, a mission-driven company. And I think our riders really see that when they think about us versus sort of some of the other choices that they can make in the market. So I think one piece of this is trust in the brand. The other piece of this that I think people talk less about is there's also just the sort of basics of transportation that need to be fulfilled, whether it's a self-driving car or a normal car. And so when we think about some of these other self-driving companies that are trying to start in the market, we know that self-driving cars will have limited coverage as they roll out. That's just kind of one of the facts of life of self-driving, that it's a question of, I think I get asked a lot, like, when are self-driving cars going to roll out? And I always say it's not when, it's where. So self-driving cars will roll out in pockets. And what that means is you really need a hybrid network that is going to be able to get you a ride to where you're going, whether that's a classic Lyft or a self-driving Lyft. You don't want to open an app where half the time cars are unavailable or half the time cars are 20 minutes away because you happen to pick the wrong route. And so I think that's the two pieces of this for Lyft and the transition to self-driving are really, one, this brand and this app that people know and trust, but two, if I open my Lyft app, I just want to get where I am going. I don't want to think about what kind of transportation I'm taking to get there. I just want transportation that works. And so I think those are really the two things that are going to be powerful as we bring more self-driving cars onto the Lyft network.
As you bring more self-driving cars onto the Lyft network, is it going to be the hybrid approach? Is that how you're going to continue to grow, where ride-sharing complements self-driving complements ride-sharing, and then you have scooters and bikes, and they'll all just work together?
Absolutely. And I think you brought up scooters and bikes. I think I would also add in sort of public transit. So if you open the Lyft app today, you'll see an integrated multimodal app. And that's kind of a transportation nerd word, but multimodal means you can just travel in multiple ways. So you can take a car, you can take a shared ride, you can take a bike, you can take a scooter, you can take a bus that's nearby, and we'll show you where the stop is. And hopefully over time, at some point in the future, we'd love to see a world where you can integrate all of that payment into one trip on the Lyft app. But particularly for self-driving, where again, we know that these cars are only going to roll out in specific areas over the next period of time, things like that last mile integration with, for instance, like a Lyft bike dock, you can imagine that we would route our cars so that their starting and ending points always are at a Lyft bike station. And then you complete that last mile of your journey on a Lyft bike. And that really allows us to bring self-driving technology with sort of all of the safety benefits and all of this is, I think goes mostly without saying, but we expect self-driving cars to broadly be electric for a good variety of reasons. But so you get all of the sort of safety benefits and all of the environmental benefits without needing to service every square mile of a city at once.
Your overall transportation vision's impressive, but let's dive into this. What is your vision for the future of self-driving cars at Lyft?
So our vision for the future of self-driving cars at Lyft is a world in which cities are reshaped around people, not cars, where we can pull out the area the size of Connecticut dedicated to parking across the country and replace it with urban parklets and affordable housing. Our vision of self-driving is a green vision. Lyft just committed to a 2030 zero emissions pledge where we expect all cars on the Lyft network to be green by 2030. And we very much believe that self-driving will be a part of that commitment. So, you're hearing me answer in terms of impact on the world. I think our vision of self-driving is that self-driving creates a better world for all of us to live in. And particularly that it shifts sort of the urban footprint that we've all grown up in, that was based around a car-oriented model, and shifts us back to a human-oriented model.
So I want to go into the sustainability because it's really impressive what Lyft has publicly stated. And I would say that probably goes back to the founding and all of the statements that have come out of Lyft back when you had the pink mustache. And there was
and the fist bump.
Yes. There was a big emphasis on sustainability and doing right with the environment. So I have to ask you, with the whole movement on Wall Street being led by BlackRock towards an ESG investment strategy, do you feel that Wall Street's properly valuing the Lyft self-driving car program?
I will stay out of anything related to financial predictions because that is so, I know when I'm in my lane and I know when I'm not. What I would say is I am proud to work at a company that makes these types of commitments. And I do think, someone has to step up and lead here, right? We know there is this classic chicken and egg problem in EVs where you need the demand to be able to create the reasonable charging network. You need, the charging network to be able to service the demand. We have to step forward and make a change here. I will say as a human, I am really excited about the changes we are making. I will leave Wall Street to the Wall Street people.
Jody, bringing this conversation full circle, we're going to go back to your days in Boston and Cambridge when you were at Harvard. In an interview with the Harvard Committee on Degrees in Social Studies Alumni Voices, you were quoted as saying, "Social studies is a tribe of the curious." You followed this up with the following remark: "Curiosity reigned in social studies, and it continues to be the major virtue I look for in my life today." Can you explain these quotes? Because I'm curious based on our conversation earlier.
So first off, for those of you who've never heard of social studies, it's really a fancy way for Harvard to make everyone who went there and majored in something called social studies get teased for the rest of their lives about having a degree in fifth grade. So it's just Harvard punishing anyone who might want to take themselves too seriously. We've found a workaround. But social studies was my undergraduate major, and was a mix of sort of economics, philosophy, history, and political science. And so one, you can tell it sort of favors people who are just generally interested in learning about the world. And two, maybe don't really want to pick a side. I mean, I think one of the things that has come out in this interview, and one of the things I really try to impart to particularly younger women thinking about what they want to do in their careers, is their careers are long, and the more you can continue to follow the most interesting and toughest questions to answer, the happier you will be in life. So I started my career in a Ugandan NGO. I now lead the self-driving program at Lyft. I very much believe that if you continue to engage your curiosity and ask good questions and never be satisfied with the answers, you will have the most satisfying and happiest of lives. That is what sort of shaped that quote for me. I think when I think about what I look for in people, whether they are people joining my team or people who I bring into my life as friends or life partners, or overwhelming attribute that I think matters the most are people who are curious about the world. Because if you stop being curious about the world, you stop trying to solve problems within it. And so my hope, particularly in this period, is that we can all find ways to maintain our curiosity even when we are stuck within the four walls of our homes.
And look at where curiosity's taken you. It's taken you from Africa to Australia to Ireland. And
it helped me meet you.
Yeah, we met. And who knows what adventure we're going to go on next. So you've had this incredible experience in the Irish government. You've been on a presidential transition team. You have a family history in politics. So I'm going to wrap it up with this question that I've been dying to know. When will you run for the United States Senate?
That depends. When are you going to come manage my campaign?
Just call. And you don't have to cold call this time either.
I hear Kamala, there's an open seat in California.
Hey, you would do a phenomenal job serving the constituents of California.
No, I mean, I always joke I grew up in Boston, and I think in some part of my brain always just wanted to be like a 1940s Irish Catholic politician in Boston, in spite of the fact that I was born in the 80s. I'm a Jewish woman and have now moved to California. But what I would say is I will continue to look for places in my life where I can try to leave the world a tiny bit better than I found it. And I hope very much that I get to do that. And I think getting to work on bringing self-driving cars to the public is a gift that I get to live out every day. And I am deeply appreciative for this experience and hope that I'll get to bring some self-driving Lyfts to cities near all of your listeners soon.
Well, we're deeply grateful for you taking the time, and thank you to listeners for listening to Jody and I tell some stories. And the future's bright, the future's autonomous, and as Jody said, always be curious. So, Jody, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy podcast. It was absolutely wonderful, and we can't wait to have you back again.
So fantastic to be here, and take care to next time in person.
Yes. Hey, maybe we can go in a self-driving car together next time.
Exactly.
Awesome. Thank you, Jody.
Thanks, Grayson. Talk soon.
Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter at Road to Autonomy or email podcast@brulteco.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte & Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte & Company. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.